Hey guys, welcome back. Welcome back. Episode number 2 of MMA After Dark on a Friday. We ready for the weekend out there? I know I am. Tomorrow, your host celebrates birthday number 37. 37 years old I am tomorrow. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about the fights. The fights happening this weekend. UFC Apex Fight Night. Kape versus Almabayev. I'm going to do a breakdown of that fight, my pick for that fight, a couple other picks on that card for tomorrow. And then, of course, my reaction to some recent fight announcements. I'm going to do initial picks, but then, of course, I'll do a further breakdown as we get closer to those fights in later March and April. A lot of fun fights out there, guys. A lot of big announcements that have just happened. So, let's get into it. Let's start the show, episode number 2 of MMA After Dark. All right, guys. So first, of course, we have to get into the Fight Night Apex card happening this weekend. I have the graphic up next to me. Before we talk about the main event, and that is an interesting fight, by the way, Kape versus Almabayev, we need to address something. Guys, I want you to look at the graphic on the screen here. First of all, this is just a hardcore fan's delight, if there ever was one. Not a lot of huge names on this card, a few that you might recognize, but there is one name on this card, aside from the main event, that I want to point you guys' attention to. There is only one other fighter competing this weekend with a ranking attached to his name, aside from the two competing in the main event, Kape and Almabayev, obviously. He has a name, and it is Charles Energy Johnson. Energy Johnson. Get it right. You know what I'm saying? All right. Charles Energy Johnson is competing this weekend, which is great. Always puts on a show, always goes for the knockout, always goes for a finish. Really exciting guy. My question is, why do we have Charles Johnson buried on the prelims of an Apex card? Let's talk about Charles Energy Johnson for a second, if I may. Charles Johnson had a rough 2023. Was struggling to string together some consistent wins. Did have one win, but I believe attached with 3 losses. Then he bounces back in a big way in 2024, racking together four straight victories, including a very impressive knockout of Joshua Van, who was surging, got a lot of hype coming into that fight. Really was the favorite in that fight, if I believe. And Charles Johnson had something to say about that. Put on a great show, got a great knockout against Joshua Van. And again, in addition to stringing together 4 consecutive wins, also got a win, a hard-fought scrap against Jake Hadley. Jake Hadley always brings, if you're not familiar with Jake Hadley, go back and watch his fight against Cody Durden. Man, the rewatch factor of that fight is just top tier. Such a fun competitive fight to watch. Jake Hadley always brings it. But back to my original point. He strings together 4 consecutive wins, finds himself in the rankings at number 12. Yet we have him, I think initially he was opening up the prelims. I think they moved him to the second fight of the night on the prelims. But back to my original point, why are we doing this? Why do we have a ranked fighter on an Apex card, a guy that strung together 4 consistent wins in 2024, coming into 2025, ready to springboard off of those 4 victories, and we have him buried in the prelims? Charles Johnson deserves better. Let me say that again. Charles Energy Johnson deserves better. First of all, like I mentioned, only other fighter on this card with a ranking attached to his name. You have the main event guys with 2 flyweights competing for, presumably, in flyweight, I mean, could be next in line for the title shot after Pantoja handles his business with Kai France. Because the division's so thin right now, Pantoja's done a really good job about clearing out a lot of the contenders, so we're looking for some fresh matchups. So you have a Charles Energy Johnson, primed to break through, maybe even a dark horse candidate in that flyweight division. You could have easily put him on the co-main with the winner potentially calling out either the winner or the loser of the main event. It'll inject some juice back into that flyweight division, some fresh matchups. Yet we have him buried on the prelims. Guys, I'm not putting any limits on Charles Johnson. I mean, clearly the guy can bounce back from adversity with a tough 2023 and couldn't have gone any better for him in 2024. I mean, let's be clear about that. But you also have a guy who's 34 years old, really coming into his own. And guys, we know that the window for these fighters to max out on their abilities as far as monetary, sponsorships, their time to shine is limited, and their time to cash in on that is limited. So why are we doing this? Why are we doing this to Charles Johnson? Why is he buried on the prelims? Over here at MMA After Dark, we are rooting for Charles Johnson. We are rooting for him to get that win because he deserves to be on the main card, whether that be in a fight night or a pay-per-view. He deserves to be on the main card. He deserves to be able to have the opportunity to cash in on his recent success. Quite frankly, before it's too late, we know these guys, all these guys are on borrowed time, right? When it comes time to, or when it comes to maxing out on their success, right? So if Charles Johnson gets it done tomorrow, he absolutely is deserving to be at a more prime position, or at least the main event of the prelims. I just cannot figure out why he's buried so deep. We are rooting for Charles Johnson over here. Good luck to you, my man, Charles Johnson. Get it done, and we want to see your success continue. But there is no reason why he should be buried this deep on the prelims. And we all, as a community, need to come together for a Charles Johnson because he is a guy that has paid his dues, a guy that bounced back in a big way from a tough 2023 into 2024, and now looking to build on that in 2025. Good luck tomorrow, Charles Johnson. We are rooting for you over here at MMA After Dark. Moving on, we have our main event. Kape versus Almabayev. Almabayev stepping up to replace the original opponent for Manel Kape, which was Brandon Royval. I was disappointed to see that that fight didn't get made. I know there were some things happening with that, but that would have been a great contest. I think the winner of that would have been primed to get the next title shot after Kai France and Pantoja handled their business. When I was breaking down this fight, I looked back at the most recent fights that we've seen from Manel Kape and Almabayev. I want to start with Almabayev. His last fight was against Mateusz Nicolau in a pretty competitive contest until that final round where Almabayev really put that final stamp on that contest when he took him down or knocked him down and then controlled him on the ground, beat him up a little bit on the ground. Um, that's also a fight, guys. If you haven't watched that fight, go back and watch it. That fight is a perfect example as why you cannot take any rounds off. You cannot take a round off to feel out your opponent. You cannot take rounds off. Every round is so precious. And to be fair, both the guys did that. I think the combined significant strikes total for both guys combined was like 10 or something like that in that first round. So not a lot happening in that first round. And then you go to the second round where Mateusz Nicolau was able to negate a lot of the takedowns, was able to land some shots on him. He seemed to be coming on into that fight. But then again, Almabayev takes over. I thought it was great advice from the Kill Cliff corner of Almabayev, where he trains with Henry Hooft. Gave him some great advice because he was throwing a lot of looping shots, a lot of loud shots. Looked a little stiff and also looked a little tired coming out of that second round. Really huffing and puffing. And I remember he had his hands on Henry Hooft's shoulders, and Henry was, "Hey, relax, relax, you got this." Um, Gave him some good advice, some adjustments to start working in that jab, cleaning up some of those looping left hooks, which weren't really doing a whole lot. And he ended up catching Mateusz Nicolau, dropping him, and ultimately ended up getting the decision in that affair. But that was a fight that I felt was winnable for Mateusz Nicolau um, if he had put his foot on the gas a little more. So that is the most recent we've seen Almabayev. Clearly, the guy has great control on the ground. Once he had Mateusz Nicolau on the ground, he was able to pretty much keep him there for quite a bit, working some ground and pound. But ultimately, it was that big shot that he landed that dropped him that was the deciding factor in that fight. Um, he is going to need to be crisp against Manel Kopp, who is dynamic on the feet. He is so fast. He darts in and out, and that was really on display against Bulldog Silva when Manel Kopp fight him in his last fight. He was just styling on him. I mean, he was doing the dribbling through the legs, and then some sort of like I don't know what that was, but he felt no kind of threat from Bulldog Silva at all, and he ended up beating him convincingly, let's say, in that fight. Um, Bulldog Silva's a tough customer, we know that, but in this coming up fight, I am picking Manel Kopp to edge out the win. I think that Manel Kopp is the slicker striker. He is going to be able to dart in and out and get those shots. I do think, though, that he needs to be very careful about some of the theatrics, some of the the dribbling between the legs, and because when he feels himself, he really starts feeling himself. But let's be clear, Asu Almabayev, if he gets him on the ground and is able to control him, then Asu Almabayev could steal this one from him. But I don't see that happening. Manel Kopp is a guy is very athletic. I think that if Asu Mabayev is able to take him down, I do think that Manel Kopp will find a way to escape um, being on the ground and turn this into a primarily stand-up affair, which I do think Manel Kopp has the edge in the striking. Asu Mabayev seems to throw, again, back to the Mateusz Nicolau fight, a lot of looping strikes. So working with Henry Hooft, I'm sure he's going to be looking to polish that up a little bit more. But I do think that overall, I think Manel Kopp is going to be just a step ahead of him in the striking and is going to be mixing it up enough to ultimately get the decision win. I'm picking Manel Kopp by decision in this fight. I think that he is athletic enough, fast enough, and is going to be able to work out of some of those takedowns enough to keep things enough on the feet to where he's going to be able to edge out those rounds in the significant strike category. We are picking Manel Kopp by decision in that fight. It is going to be an interesting stylistic matchup, so I'm looking forward to seeing that. Would it surprise me if Asu Almabayev were to edge out this win or find a way to control him on the ground enough, get in some grounded pound, enough to edge out some of those rounds to beat Manel Kopp? It would not surprise me, but I am picking Manel Kopp by decision to narrowly edge out Asu Almabayev, which should springboard him into the next um, championship fight against either Alexandre Pantoja or Kai Kara France after they finish their business. But we know who Manel Kopp is rooting for in that fight because he has the most disdain for Kai Kara France. It was on full display. I think it was about a year ago when he went down to, um, forgive me, it was either Australia or New Zealand. And he had a lot to say about Kai Kara France, both at the press conference and after his victory in the ring when DC had to wrestle back the microphone away from him from some of the things he had to say about Manel Kopp and City Kickboxing, for that matter, which we also saw him get into that verbal exchange with Israel Adesanya at that press conference. That was a very entertaining press conference, one of my favorites, actually. So that was some fun stuff. But I do see Manel Kopp edging out this victory against Asu Almabayev. That is my official pick for that fight. Other fights on that card. We have to look at the Nasrat Hakparast against Esteban Ribovic. I love that they put this fight together, guys. Both guys pretty dynamic on the feet. We know about Esteban Ribovic. He was in the fight of the year last year against Daniel Zellhuber, which was just very violent, but also very technical. It wasn't one of these fights where guys are just swinging wild and just landing crazy shots and just looping hooks and desperation shots. Both guys remained technical throughout that entire contest, and that was such a fun fight to watch. I mean, it was violent, it was explosive, but technical. So whether you're a guy that appreciates a nice technical stand-up contest, or a guy that just appreciates just a all action, blood and guts affair, doesn't care about styles. It served both parties, right? That was such a great fight. Esteban Ribovic has got some skills, guys. He's got some skills, and he's looking through to break through at lightweight in a major way to springboard off of that Daniel Zellhuber victory against Nasrat Haqparast, who can get some things done on the feet. I love this matchup. I think this is a fight that's going to primarily stand on the feet. I do have Esteban Ribovic edging out Nasrat Haqparast by decision in that fight. If you're not familiar with these guys, get to know them. Get to know them. They're fun fighters. If you haven't watched the Esteban Ribovic fight against Daniel Zellhuber last year at UFC Noche at the Apex, or forgive me, the Apex, at the Sphere rather, that was great. And again, one of those fights where just the rewatch factor of that fight is, again, just top tier. You could rewatch that fight every day and it just won't get old. Great fight. We are picking Esteban Ribovic by decision against Nasrat Haqparast. Nasrat Haqparast is a tough guy. He's a guy that's going to be able to take the shots of Esteban Ribovic. Would it be surprised if Ribovic got the finish? It wouldn't surprise me, but I think Nasrat Haqparast's toughness is going to really shine in this affair. He's not a guy that's one of these guys that just gets cracked and is just done for. He's a guy that can stand and bang. He's a guy that can take punishment, and I love this matchmaking, but I do think that ultimately Esteban Ribovic is going to be the one that secures this victory. Very good defensively, too. I think that he has the slight edge in that defensive boxing, striking category against Nasrat Haqparast. In that fight against Daniel Zellhuber, and again, guys, please go back and watch that fight if you haven't. I really can't stress that enough. Just a classic fight. He was able to absorb a lot of Daniel Zellhuber's bigger strikes with being defensively sound. He is a guy that has fantastic technique, great movement, great movement on the feet, great head movement, and a guy that gets in, throws his shots, and is also just very defensively smart and sound. And I think the combination of those things is just going to be a little too much for Nasrat Haqparast. So we are picking Esteban Ribovic to win that affair by decision. All right, guys, moving on. Moving on, we had some recent fight announcements. We finally have a replacement for Dan Hooker, which is going to be Rafael Fiziev. I know that was already announced earlier this week. Shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. That's not breaking news by any means. But let's talk about the fight for a little bit. This is part two, the sequel we get from the first affair when we had Justin Gaethje edging out, and I am going to say edging out, that victory against Rafael Fiziev. Guys, if you're an MMA fan, you know that fight. It's been discussed, but I encourage you guys to go back and watch that fight without commentary. Going into the third round, the commentators were saying it was 1-1, one apiece. If you scored it that way, I don't have an issue with that. But let's dive a little bit deeper into this fight. It was pretty much the consensus that Fiziev in that first fight took round one. He was landing some pretty heavy strikes and landing a lot of body strikes with the kicks, which pretty much ultimately at the end of the fight, I think Gaethje overall edged out the significant strikes by probably less than 10. He did score more head strikes, but the body was where Rafael Fiziev did a lot of his work, and it seemed to pay off. There's also this thought that's been put out there and has seemed to stick to the narrative of Rafael Fiziev that he gassed in the third round. Some have gone as far to say that he gassed bad. When I was watching that third round, did he look as crisp as he did in the first round? No, he didn't. I didn't see a guy that was just gassed and depleted, whose arms were hanging at his side, and a guy that was swinging from his hips, and a guy that didn't have any movement. But let's be clear, Justin Gaethje did his best work in that third round. I think it was the end of the second round or second half of the second round where he started to cut open Fiziev a little bit and then really went to work on that cut, and then we saw him land that big uppercut and really went head hunting in that third round. And of course, the visual at the end of the fight, we know the biggest criteria rather for these fights is damage. And you really can't deny that when you look at them both and we look at the cuts that Fiziev sustained in that fight, and some of those big shots he took in the third round, I think ultimately that was what swayed the judges. And by no means do I disagree with the decision, but I do think that that was a razor close fight. Upon second watch, I lean a little bit more towards a draw in that fight. There was a judge, I think it was Clemens Warner, that scored it a draw. In a nutshell, this is what I saw in that fight. I saw Fiziev winning the first round and a half, and then Justin Gaethje winning second half of the second round through the third round. Dead even. I don't have a problem with them giving that decision to Gaethje because, again, it's very hard when you have a fight that's that close, both visually and in the stats. Significant strikes, very close, very close. Separated by 10 or less, I think. I have to go back and double check, but it wasn't one of these fights where one guy was ahead, 20, 30 significant strikes opposed to the other guy. But again, you have the guy standing next to referees at the end of the fight, and then just a visual of Fiziev's cuts, right? Him just bleeding. And then you have a Gaethje who looked pretty much like he could keep going, right? Fiziev looked visually more beat up, and I think that was what swayed the judges. But if we're just looking at round by round, I scored the first round for Fiziev. I scored the second round to draw. I mean, because you really had Fiziev that continued to build off that first round, kept bringing it to him till about almost pretty close to the 2 minute and 30-second mark. And then you saw Gaethje really start to do his best work, started to open up that cut on Fiziev, and then really went to work more on that cut and then those uppercuts in that third round. And I think that was the round he also scored that takedown as well. So I scored it a draw upon second watch. To be clear, I don't have an issue with them scoring that fight for Gaethje. But again, I don't think this was a definitive, Gaethje won, crystal clear. I think it was one of those fights where if you had a scorecard for Fiziev, sure. If you scored the fight a draw, sure. You scored the fight for Gaethje, good with it also. And when you have a fight that's that close, how can you not be excited about these guys running it back for a second time? The question is now, what version of Rafael Fiziev are we going to see? Because the last time we saw him, he sustained that nasty injury against Mateusz Gamrot in the second round. This is his first fight coming back since. Heck of a way to make a comeback fight against Justin Gaethje. It speaks to the toughness of Fiziev and his will to want to get back in the title picture. This isn't a guy that wants easy fights. This is a guy that wants to do damage. This is a guy that wants to smoke. This is a guy that threw his name in the hat to get the Justin Gaethje sweepstakes when Dan Hooker sustained that hand injury. He wants it. The question is, though, now what version do we see of him, right? It has been a while now since that injury he sustained against Mateusz Gamrot. He does not also strike me, though, as a guy that would rush back a significant injury. I think we're going to see a Fiziev that, as far as physical abilities, has not taken any steps back. I think that he's a guy that probably took his time, wanted to make sure he was prepared, and unless he felt like he had a legitimate shot of winning this fight, I don't think he would have thrown his hat in the ring on a short notice fight. But how can you not, guys? How can you not? I mean, this is guaranteed action for 3 rounds. This fight bangs. And now you got Justin Gaethje also coming off the well-documented loss against Max Holloway last year, UFC 300, stole the show. Unfortunately, Justin Gaethje was on the losing end of that affair. But I do think that Max landed some very specific big shots in that fight that made it hard for Justin Gaethje to really ever get going, particularly when I think he broke his nose earlier in the contest. Made it really hard for Gaethje to do what he does, right? So I think these guys are meeting right now at the perfect time because they're both in similar situations. They are both looking for another chance to break through to that next level. Gaethje is a guy that feels, and he has stated in interviews, that he's not done, that he's still very much looking to continue to win and insert himself back in that title picture. Now, if he does, only time will tell. We're going to have to wait and see. This was a tough one for me, guys, because Gaethje clearly hasn't taken a step back. He's still in his prime. I believe at 34 he is now, I want to say. So we haven't started to see that decline in him. He is a guy that's been in just a ton of wars. I mean, at the expense of entertaining us, right? I mean, just how can you not love Justin Gaethje? Um, all action fighter, world class guy, known as a good guy in the sport. He's a guy that you just can't help but rooting for, and of course he puts out all action fights all the time. I'm going to pick Rafael Fiziev again to narrowly edge out Justin Gaethje. I think that based on what we saw last time in the fight was very close, closer than most people probably think. Again, if you know don't believe me, please go back and watch that fight. Watch it without commentary. I think you'll get a better sense of what occurred in that fight. Um, this fight's close. On paper, this fight is going to be close, and I think Fiziev opened up as a favorite, which actually very much surprised me, given that Gaethje won the last contest. Gaethje, I mean, obviously he sustained the broken nose in the Max Holloway fight, but I mean that happens semi-frequently in the sport, right? As opposed to Fiziev, who had that nasty injury that he needed to take some time off from the sport to make sure that that healed and recovered appropriately. Um, so that actually surprised me going into that fight, or going into this fight, I should say, that Fiziev is opening up as the favorite. Um, Ironically, I'm picking him to win this fight, but it did surprise me. We'll see how those odds change. It wouldn't surprise me if they change as we get closer to fight night. But right now, Fiziev does seem to be the favorite. We are picking Fiziev to narrowly edge out a victory against Justin Gaethje. I think that he's going to come into this fight in shape. I think he's going to be a little more defensively sound, which he's going to need to be. He is not going to be able to implement that same approach of just getting in Gaethje's range, that danger zone, and just being wild. He needs to be a little more defensively sound. I think that was probably the big takeaway from the first fight. He strikes me as a smart guy, a guy that looks to improve, that looks to build off of his victories and his defeats. So I expect Fiziev to be a little more defensively sound, a little more calculated, do a little bit more striking at distance, really continue to work in those body shots with his kicks and his punches. And I think if he is able to implement that game plan, he should be able to edge out Justin Gaethje very narrowly. But we'll wait and see. Moving on, we have the announcement from last week that I'm barely getting to. We got the former champ, Volkanovski, with another chance at regaining his featherweight title. He is taking on Diego Lopes, the surging Diego Lopes, who, since coming on against that premier last minute replacement against Movsar Evloev, I mean, could things have gone better for him? I mean, he stole all the fans from Movsar Evloev that Movsar Evloev probably thought he should have got after defeating Diego Lopes. Diego Lopes is surging right now, and Alexander Volkanovski is not. Um, so let's talk about this fight a little bit. We know what the last three fights have looked like for Alexander Volkanovski. Unfortunately, things haven't panned out for him. He got brutally knocked out against now I guess former champion Ilya Topuria, who has now vacated his belt to move up to lightweight. Um, First round, he looked pretty good. Excuse me, I was thinking of the Holloway fight. He was looking good until he wasn't, which a lot of the times is the case when guys fight Ilya Topuria. But he has shown, even in his recent losses, that he is still very technical. He's still very sharp. He has shown that he still has a lot to put out, even at 36 years old. He is by no means fallen off a cliff. Um, he can still make things happen in these fights, but it's going to be interesting to see how things pan out against a Diego Lopes, who is going to be a lot to handle for Alexander Volkanovski. Diego Lopes is a guy right now who is just surging with confidence. He has complete belief in his capabilities. He believes he should be there. He believes that regardless of what Movsar says, that he is the guy that should be fighting, that he is the deserving guy in this fight against Volkanovski. And so when we look at this fight, you have Volkanovski, who might be the most skilled featherweight we've ever seen. I mean, what can't Alexander Volkanovski do? He can hurt you on the feet. His wrestling is top notch. His submission defense is top notch. He is a guy that can beat you up on the ground. He's a guy that can beat you up on the feet. He's a guy that was shown to be able to take a punch very well up until these last three fights. Now, granted, I mean, two of those were Islam Makhachev, the current lightweight champ, and Ilia Topuria, who was just knocking out everybody, right? So if you're going to have your chin questioned, I mean, are we going to hold it against him that it was against Islam Makhachev, pound for pound number one guy right now, and Ilia Topuria, also a guy that's in the top pound for pound rankings right now? No, we're not. So the question is, what are the paths to victories for these guys? Well, let's look at Diego Lopes. So Diego Lopes is a guy that was known when he came into the UFC is a jiu-jitsu guy. And when we think about jiu-jitsu guys, we think about guys that will sometimes get leg kicked, fall to their back, guys that will concede takedowns, or guys that'll get knocked down and lay on their back and just invite them. Hey, come on. Well, now that I'm down, you come down, kind of thing. That is not Diego Lopes. Diego Lopes is a guy that is so offensively minded and so aggressive with his jiu-jitsu. He is always looking to attack with his jiu-jitsu. He is always looking to turn something into nothing when on the ground and in scrambles. That was on full display, guys, again, in the Movsar fight. He had Movsar in some tough spots. Credit to Movsar and his flexibility, to be honest, because Movsar had him in a nasty armbar, a nasty knee bar, and I think a couple other submission attempts that commentary team was saying, "Oh man, this is close. This could be over. He might have him right here." Diego is always looking to attack in all facets of the game. He is also a guy that has continued to polish up that boxing. He is a guy that has sneaky power, and that was on full display in the Yusuf uh, fight that we had back at UFC 300 when he knocked him out pretty early in the fight. Funny story. I was about to turn in a parlay, and that fight was on my parlay, and I didn't get it. I didn't get it in time, and then before I knew it, it blinked, and that fight was over. Diego Lopes knocked him out pretty badly. He's a guy that can mix it up. He likes to get into closer distance when striking. Not a huge distance striker guy, but he is a guy that can box. He's a guy that can mix it up. He has some fast hands. He has some sneaky, heavy hands. And I worry for Volkanovski that when those exchanges do happen, when both guys are closing distance, that might be a danger zone for Volkanovski. I look back at the Lopes and Yusuf fight, and when he got into range with Yusuf, well, it didn't surprise me, but he was really able to put that boxing onto him at close distance, and I think there's going to be some moments in this fight where we see some of those exchanges in the pocket, exchanges at close distance, and I think ultimately Diego Lopes is going to catch him. I think he's going to catch him with something and drop him. He might not knock him out. But once that happens, and Volk is on his back, you're in Diego Lopes's world. I will say this though. We have some questions about Lopes's gas tank. He is a guy that comes like a bat out of hell. First round, just goes for the kill. In the Dan Ige fight, we saw him kind of gassing that third round a little bit. If Volk can weather that early storm for him and push it through the fourth round, the fifth round, that is going to be a huge advantage for Alexander Volkanovski. Because as a long reigning champion, this was a guy that was used to training, preparing, and being in a lot of 5-round contests. If he can weather that early storm against Lopes, I love Alexander Volkanovski's chances. Now, the question is, do we think it's going to get there at some point? I'm currently leaning towards no. Diego Lopes is dynamic, guys. He is a guy that has steadily worked himself up the ranks. Um, this is not a guy that just got boosted and jumped the line. He fought and beat Yusuf. He fought and beat Ortega. Beat up Ortega pretty bad, actually, in that fight. Um, Ortega showed a lot of heart. I mean, who's going to question Ortega after that fight, right? I just think Diego Lopes, a surging Diego Lopes right now, is going to just be a little bit too much for Alexander Volkanovski. I'm predicting a second round finish for Diego Lopes in that fight. Those are my initial thoughts about the fight. As we get closer to that fight, I'll have a little bit better of a breakdown of that fight. I want to go back and watch a few more of their previous fights, get into the X's and O's of that fight a little bit more. But that is who I am taking initially. I do have right to change my pick as we get closer to that fight. Right now, I am leaning towards Lopes by a slight margin. Last topic for today, guys. It was announced that Jamal Hill's next fight will be against Khalil Rountree. This fight makes sense. This fight makes sense for both guys. Both guys coming off losses. In Hill's case, coming off of a couple straight losses. We know about the loss he was handed to by the champion Alex Pereira. Just that nasty, nasty hook that caught him. It's been on a million memes, T-shirts, GIFs, all over the internet. And Jamal Hill has really taken a hit in the media. He's taken a hit on social media. He's taken a hit with the fan base. While Khalil Rountree just seems to become everyone's darling after that just um, brave and inspiring performance he put on against Alex Pereira in a losing contest. But we haven't seen too many guys get into the fourth round, or even really the third round against Alex Pereira. He put forth a great effort. He showed he has a lot of skills, a lot of heart. He shows that he will not be broken easily. And he actually did not lose a lot of stock in that fight. If anything, I think his stock kind of went up a little bit because I think there were a lot of people predicting Pereira to finish him pretty early. I was not one of those people. I thought that Rountree had enough skills and toughness to push it through to, I think I said back in the third round. Ultimately, he made it to the fourth, but we saw Pereira really put it on him in that kind of mid-third round, and that fight just took a nasty turn for Khalil Rountree, and we know what happened. Ultimately, got finished him with some body shots and headshots, uppercuts. That nasty punch that we saw on replay a million times, where Khalil Rountree's nose just explodes. Um, but that man is a force to be reckoned with for anyone, and so is Jamal Hill for that matter. Um, I thought Khalil Rountree looked good in the Pereira fight. Obviously, he wasn't able to bring it home, but he showed a lot of promise in that fight. And we have Jamal Hill, who we most recently saw at UFC 311 at the Intuit Dome against Yuri Prohaska. I was surprised in that fight how stiff and to be frank, a little slow Jamal Hill looked in that fight. When I think of peak Jamal Hill, I think about the guy that we saw, obviously, in the Glover Teixeira fight. And I know everyone wants to say, oh, there was a wash Teixeira. Well, no one was saying that coming into that fight. All right, so let's be fair. Let's be fair to Glover Teixeira. He was the champion at the time, a deserving champion at the time. And that is the best I've ever seen Jamal Hill look. He was a guy in that fight that looked light on his feet, a guy that was moving, bobbing in and out, landing heavy shots and then getting out of danger. A guy that got taken down but was able to find his way back up and primarily keep things on the feet, where he just kept beating up Glover Teixeira. Did not get ahead of himself and get sloppy in that fight. He showed an ability to be technical and, again, an ability to land meaningful strikes and get out of danger. And also, he showed that he has a gas tank. He showed that he can go 5 rounds in a grueling fight with Glover Teixeira. And I know by and large it was a one-sided contest, but the output that Jamal Hill um, put in that fight on Glover Teixeira and to still be able to be not completely gassed, still hanging in there in that fifth round. And Teixeira made things a little interesting in that fifth round when he got that takedown. But I don't think at any point Jamal Hill looked like he was gassed out, like he was about ready to concede Glover Teixeira's takedowns and let Glover Teixeira take over that fight. He showed a lot of heart in that fight as well. So he proved in that fight that he's got all the goods. But then we know what happened, right? He sustained the injury, rushed back from the injury, got the knockout from Pereira, and now we got the knockout from Yuri. And now he is stepping in to fight a Khalil Rountree, who is probably just peaking and is just oozing confidence right now. Ironically, after a loss himself. But what he showed against Alex Pereira shows that he is also a force to be reckoned with. Jamal Hill desperately needs to win this fight if he wants to continue to be in the conversation of any kind of title implications at all. I don't know if the same can be said for Khalil Rountree. Um, but Jamal Hill, I mean, he's at a crossroads right now. I think a loss, especially a bad loss against Khalil Rountree, I think now we just start looking at fun fights, fun action fights, fun matchmaking in the bottom of the top 10 or the 10 to 15. He's a guy that can beat anyone in the top 15 on any given night. But now with the three, if he loses against Rountree, making it 3 straight losses, if he gets finished by Rountree, that will be 3 straight losses by finish. That is going to be hard to come back from, especially when we have a dominant champion right now in Pereira who is looking to handle his business against Ankalaev. And if he does, well, I don't think that anyone is going to be looking to rebook him versus Jamal Hill if Jamal Hill loses. If he wins, if he is able to beat, and if he is able to knock out Khalil Rountree, and assuming that Pereira handles his business, which I'm going to make a separate video for that, and by no means am I saying that, am I picking that right now, that Pereira is going to handle his business. And, I mean, there's no bigger fan of Alex Pereira in this home than you're going to find. I mean, hey, Chama, right? I mean, who doesn't love Alex Pereira? But I have a lot to say about that matchup. But if he wins, and if he does beat Magomed Ankalaev, and then you have Jamal Hill coming off of a knockout win against a Khalil Rountree, I think you can very easily insert him back into that conversation. And I think the fans wouldn't mind seeing that rematch either. There's a lot of bad blood between there. I mean, we saw Jamal Hill show up to Alex's gym and say, "Hey, let's do it." I mean, you can say what you want to about that. I mean, Alex was game. Hey, put the gloves on. Let's do it. And then Jamal, no, no, I'm not going to fight for money. But I mean, there's a lot of bad blood there. Going back to when Jamal just put it on Glover Teixeira, Alex's mentor and coach. which is, in my mind, kind of where everything started. But then there was a lot of words exchanged leading up to that fight. There was a lot of talk, and Jamal Hill wasn't able to back it up, unfortunately. But he has a big opportunity now. A win over a Khalil Rountree, who proved to be a force to be reckoned with against Alex Pereira. He comes in and gets that win, that finish, or even that knockout. You could inject him back into that title conversation uh, picture immediately. And the same can be said for Khalil Rountree. Based on what we've recently seen, I am going to pick Khalil Rountree to beat Jamal Hill. I don't think we are going to see enough of the Jamal Hill we saw against Glover Teixeira against Khalil Rountree. I think that Jamal Hill should have taken a little bit more time. He feels this need to rush to get back in the mix of things. I don't know if this comes from a place of like not wanting to be forgotten, not wanting to be talked about. He's always injecting himself on his podcast, social media. He keeps injecting himself into the conversation, which is what he should be doing, right? I mean, he wants that opportunity again. But I just cannot get over how slow and stiff he looked against Yuri. That was a big opportunity for him. That was not the best version of him. Uh, that was not any kind of version of him that I saw against Glover Teixeira. Again, when he was just moving in and out, just seemed to be so light on the feet, and an ability to land heavy shots and remain light on the feet and avoid danger. It just did not seem to be there. Um, I thought Yuri could see his shots coming from a mile away, and we saw that in the finish where Yuri was able to just dodge that punch, and I love that slow motion shots of him just moving back, and then catching Jamal Hill right on that chin, and then just knocking him out. Um, I think that if that version of him shows up against Khalil Rountree, it's going to be a long night for Jamal Hill. So, that being said, I am picking Khalil Rountree to finish Jamal Hill by knockout. I predict that to come in the second or third round. Probably not the first round. But I think Khalil Rountree is just going to be too much. I think he's peaking right now. I think he's full of confidence and ability. And this is also a fight that both guys want to keep on the feet. So should be a great fight, should be a great action fight. Khalil showed that he can take Alex's best punch and keep going and keep going and keep going until he is absolutely 100% depleted. Most guys, it doesn't matter if you're 100% depleted or not. You take Alex's best shot and you're going to sleep. Khalil did not go to sleep. He was just depleted. He was gassed, he was depleted, and he was getting a beating put on him. But by no means did he get put to sleep. Um, so I think he is going to be able to take Jamal's best punch and keep going, implement his game, land heavy shots, and I predict a second or third round finish for Khalil Rountree Jr. and keep his name alive in the title picture. That's all I got for today, guys. Thanks so much for joining me today on episode number 2 of MMA After Dark. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. It means a whole lot to me. It doesn't cost you a thing. Look for me on the socials at MMA After Dark on the X. And I will be actively tweeting during the fights this weekend my initial thoughts of the fights for UFC Apex, Kape versus Almabayev. So should be some fun stuff happening this weekend. And then, of course, I will have my predictions and breakdowns for next weekend's big pay-per-view fights when we see the champion Alex Poatan Pereira take on Magomed Ankalaev for the light heavyweight crown. Thanks so much for joining me, guys. This is your host, Paul. Have a great weekend. Be safe out there, and I'll see you next time on MMA After Dark.